In 2010, Felix Schellberg, known better as PewDiePie, created a YouTube channel and along with it a persona now known by almost anyone who has ever even been near the internet. As even he would tell you, the early years of his content were, much like the site around it, a product of an internet whose culture was still forming itself. The videos to come out of this period were marked by crude and offensive humor, taking the form of jokes about sexual assault, marginalized groups, and use of slurs. Some of these, it seems he knew were bad at the time, for instance his use of a Swedish word roughly equivalent to the N-word being translated to black in the subtitles of his early videos narrated in the language. Other instances, though thought to be acceptable at the time, he seems regretful of, at one point admitting his use of jokes at the expense of the LGBTQ+ community were a mistake.
I still make kind of stupid jokes that I shouldn't make, but I feel like back then I didn't understand. I was so immature, and I just thought things were funny just because they were offensive.
Here's the thing, I could talk for a long time about every individual video he's made where he's messed up, and every apology he's made to cover for it. But all that would serve to do is to try to say who Felix is. But I don't need to explain to anyone who he is. I mean that obviously in the sense that he's a famous video gamer, everyone knows who he is, but also in the sense that, in large part, I'm not particularly concerned with who exactly he might be as a person. This video isn't about who he is, or even directly his content. Instead, this video is PewDiePie in the words of those who defend him. Rather than analyze exclusively what he has done, we're going to look at his history and scandals through the lens of what was said to defend him in their aftermath, and ask what they tell us both about the actions they concern and our ideas of the man behind those actions. In order to accurately portray both the evolution of PewDiePie and of his defenders, we're going to be looking at this basically chronologically, beginning with his first major controversy over 3 years ago. Throughout the video, I'm going to be talking somewhat broadly about certain articles and videos I read and watched, since I don't have enough time to talk about every single one in depth in this video. However, all of the sources I used for the video can be found in the description, so I encourage everyone to check them out, and even follow along with the video using them. So, without further rambling, let's look at some actions, some defenses, and some lies. Okay, so I know the title card said that this bit is about the events of early 2017, and while we'll get to that, to begin our journey through the rhetoric surrounding PewDiePie, we have to go a bit further back, to 2013, when he was sitting at about 13 million subscribers. In September of that year, a Variety article entitled "If PewDiePie is YouTube's Top Talent, We're All Doomed" was published. Now, like every article I'm going to be referencing in this video, I've read the whole thing, and it is, while strongly worded, more cynical of a perceived growing irrelevancy of traditional media to the youth, though I would argue that such mediums are almost never especially relevant to the young people of any period of time, than it is cruel to the Pewds, with the best insult presented being calling him a blithering idiot or aggressively stupid. But this article seemed to affect Felix pretty personally, considering the fact he brought it up again as recently as 2017. Now, I don't blame him for taking it a bit personally. I mean, if someone wrote an article about how they didn't like me very much, I would probably at least remember it. But PewDiePie makes clear in this video that the instance has pretty significantly formed, or at least reinforced, what he believes about traditional news media and their relationship to internet personalities such as himself. And when, you might be wondering, did he have reason to mention it? Oh, just after he, paid some people to dance around with a sign that said "Death to all Jews." Oh, what? Don't worry though, after this happened, a lot of people had explanations for how this was a big misunderstanding, or something. So, why don't we take a look at some of these people, see what they said, and ask if they're right or not. When I was scripting this episode, I couldn't decide whether to go over the media articles or the videos defending PewDiePie first, since even though this video is about those defending PewDiePie, to give this any context I also have to cover those other parts of the situations. But in the end, even though it's a little bit messy, I'm just going to be referencing individual articles and other sources when they become relevant to the video at hand, since I've decided that's the most natural way to do it, so please bear with me. All of these are linked in the bibliography below, so give them a look if you'd like. So, in January 2017, PewDiePie, in a video about the internet site Fiverr, a site where you can pay people for any number of services, paid two individuals to dance with a sign that said, by his request, death to all Jews, and subsequently say, subscribe to Keemstar. For reasons no one is yet sure of, media outlets began to report on this thing that a massively popular public figure with significant audience did. The story was initially broken by the Wall Street Journal, which resulted in them being the primary target of both PewDiePie and his fans' ire. But, true to his fanbase's reputation of dedication, a lot of people started to come out of the woodwork to defend him. And, as people with questionable motives coming out of the woodwork to defend someone who did something awful tend to do, some of them ended up on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is where we'll start, because I think that these interviews pretty succinctly sum up a large portion of what we'll be hearing a lot today. Some of you may be aware of a certain guy by the name of Carl Benjamin, better known by his online handle, Sargon of Akkad. He appeared on Rogan in late June of 2017, and one of the topics they covered was PewDiePie's situation, a whole 13 minutes of coverage in fact. As he introduces the topic, already tying this issue to right-wing politics and not just humor, Joe starts running through a short list of things considered not advertiser-friendly, and among these things is anything right-wing. Interestingly though, this was around the same time that it was becoming clear that many LGBTQ+ topics, generally considered left-wing or at very least liberal for obvious reasons, were also being marked as non-advertiser friendly by YouTube's algorithms. I wonder why on earth he might happen to forget to mention this little fact. Anyway, the conversation progresses a bit, which brings Rogan to an implication we're going to hear a lot today. That PewDiePie was a threat to the Wall Street Journal and more widely traditional news media in general. In order to justify this, he compares the YouTube followings of the WSJ and Felix, which is weird to say the least. Sure, that claim makes sense if you literally don't think about it at all. The viewerships, demographics, and purposes of the guy who plays Minecraft and looks at memes and the Wall Street Journal are probably not exactly overlapping groups. Rogan's claim here is weird, but it is, at least in the basic concept, that there's something more behind all of this, something a lot of people seriously seem to buy into. This combined with the fact that Joe says that the media claims PewDiePie is an anti-Semite or a racist, which, spoiler alert, isn't true, it just isn't. I've read a lot of articles, and literally the most critical one doesn't say that he's a racist, because guess what? You can say that someone did something anti-Semitic or racist without it being character assassination. Makes two main tactics being employed. The first one is what I'll call the conspiracy. That, in some way, the situation isn't what it seems, in that someone involved had it in their interest to see PewDiePie hurt. Here, it's implied that that someone happens to be the WSJ. However, near the end of the video, Sargon brings up an interesting point. When Joe speculates on why exactly the Wall Street Journal might want to do such a thing, again implying that they had to have some underhanded reason to want to report a major news story, Carl posits that it's because Felix quote-unquote mocks social justice and feminism, which brings us to the second main point of this interview, a conflation of the problems faced by PewDiePie and those faced by the right wing. But between these two tactics, there exists a common purpose, which is to avoid actually discussing the things that happened themselves. Both Rogan and Sargon frame the events surrounding PewDiePie indirectly, focusing not on what he did, but on the media's response. Rogan had an earlier interview with Philip DeFranco where he did the exact same thing.
Is that literally what they said? That context does not matter?
What was it? It was one of the people. I'm gonna get the problem is so many people have written.
What we're going to see time and time again as we go through more of these videos is that people defending PewDiePie from criticism love to pretend that the criticism says he's an awful person, or a Nazi, or a racist, or an anti-Semite, because those are easy points to play defense against. If you act like these wild claims are being made, it makes whatever lesser claim actually being made look a lot less bad in comparison. And I say they're pretending that that's what people are saying because, well, they are. It's all just not true, and there's very little way around that fact. Across dozens of articles about him from reputable sources, again, these linked in the bibliography, there is not a single claim made that PewDiePie himself is in any way one of those things. The most critical articles at very worst say the things he did were racist, anti-Semitic, or fascist adjacent. Also, one of them makes fun of his intername, but PewDiePie would never hold something trivial like that against the entire profession for years, right? Right? If you are claiming that it was a widespread idea presented by the media that these things were true of PewDiePie, you're lying. Speaking of lying, it's time to talk about Armored Skeptic. Now, you might remember several seconds ago when I included that clip of Philip DeFranco definitely correctly quoting people at Joe Rogan about context. Context is really important when considering any PewDiePie controversy because people coming to his defense constantly invoke it as if contextualizing something automatically takes away any individual meaning it might have. Armored Skeptic thinks that context is important. So important, in fact, that he incorrectly contextualizes things that happened. Yeah. When discussing a prior instance where Felix had dressed up in a uniform meant to have Nazi aesthetics, Skeptic says that this video was to mock the very real journalists calling him a Nazi, when in fact, if you look at the actual video, it was to mock the YouTube Partner Program's monetization policy and predated any widespread criticism of his actions. And I was baffled by this. Like, how, when crying about people not properly contextualizing things, do you fuck up your contextualization that badly? And it's not just him, a lot of people made this claim. And while I've looked around and I can't find where this originated, it's absolutely hilarious to me that so many people talking about the importance of context happen to get their context from other people lying about the situation and not the original videos themselves. In fact, Philip DeFranco gave the original correct story on Rogan in February, and 4 months later, when Sargon was on the show, he gave the wrong version, and Joe Rogan, a man who definitely understands the internet, literally had no problem with that. Anyway, Armored Skeptic also has a theory about the grand conspiracy to take down PewDiePie, and, it's something. As opposed to the media, he posits that maybe YouTube was behind it, and had been looking for a reason to get rid of him. The inherent implication being, as was Sargon's opinion, that it was because of PewDiePie's political views. In order to back this claim up, he notes the suspicious nature of the cut happening right before Felix's new YouTube Red series, Scare PewDiePie Season 2, was supposed to drop. But, someone remind me again, why on earth would that make any sense? Why would it be in YouTube's interest to not profit off of someone they had already invested in so significantly with no chance of return on that investment if they cut him? And the worldview's claim doesn't really make that much sense either. In terms of actual opinions he's expressed outside of an alleged joking context, PewDiePie's views are at this point at worst like stupid, uninformed, and alt-right adjacent. He's not someone who would admit to having views as malicious as, say, Sargon or Armored Skeptic. A lot of people who are and have been very popular on YouTube personally have or propagate much worse views, like, say, Joe Rogan, so why would they go after PewDiePie specifically? If the videos where he's jokingly saying racist or anti-Semitic things aren't actually representative of who he is, then why would it be targeted here by YouTube? I don't think it's really worth our time to dwell on this question very long. The fact of the matter is that the claims just don't make sense. And I don't think the point is really for them to make sense, and that's not exclusive to Armored Skeptic. Most people, him included, aren't even really reading the articles written about it, you know, the actual explanations of how the media is responding to these things. Instead, most people, if interacting with it at all, did so by watching one Wall Street Journal video, which, yeah, is kind of bad, maybe, but by doing that, they are refusing to contextualize and really explain the point that the media is trying to make. The reason so many people use the media response, and even then largely refuse to honestly interact with that media coverage, as their only point of interaction with the controversy, is because it distracts from having to actually discuss the things Felix did. Oh, by the way, I didn't know a good place to mention it, but in this video Armored Skeptic also implies that the Daily Stormer, the most significant hate site on the internet, is just ironic, so that's cool. Ethan Klein is someone who did a really great job of failing to address any serious points in his video on the subject. He starts the video with the practically obligatory reference to how the media is totally saying that PewDiePie is a raging anti-Semite, but then he takes an interesting turn into the well-known argumentative strategy of, actually, I thought that calling for genocide was really funny. Now, in response to me characterizing his point that way, Ethan might say that it would be unfair of me to say that PewDiePie's sign was quote-unquote calling for genocide. And sure, I'll concede that I don't know what the intent behind it was any more than anyone else does. But Ethan Klein also doesn't know what the intent was, and so to act like it's insane to say that the action was anti-Semitic, but say it is entirely reasonable to say it was okay because it was a joke, influenced entirely by your own anecdotal reaction to it, is a weird prioritization of opinions, to say the least. Ethan goes on to also make the claim that what Felix did was meant to be commentary, that he was trying to make a point about, quote, what you can get someone to do for $5, unquote. But if that's what was happening, it's shitty commentary? And even if it happened to have been commentary, which again is unclear because we can't figure out what's going on in PewDiePie's head, that doesn't mean everything that happened is fine because of that. If I took a shit on Ethan Klein's doorstep because I could, sure I could say that that's commentary on places I can take a shit if I want to, but I'm not really saying anything about it beyond, wow, look at what just happened. That's awful, isn't it? You can tell I'm taking this really seriously by the gleeful expression on my face. You'd think that in such a situation, where he had just used an online service to pay people to dance around with a sign calling for ethnic cleansing, Felix would have had something more to say about that situation than I didn't think they'd really do it. And at least to me, it doesn't really seem like PewDiePie even thinks there's anything wrong with that situation. Right before he completes the transaction, he has this to say.
Listen, alright, before everyone starts judging me, alright, they get paid, they want to do this, alright, so don't be all like, oh, PewDiePie has money, so he makes other people do weird shit, alright. I'm sure they are more than happy by the fact that I'm helping their business. I am supporting businesses right now.
So, like, literally the one thing you could claim he's making meaningful commentary on, he immediately tries to absolve himself of any connection to before the thing has even happened. Interesting. Another interesting approach in defending the Pewds came from this charming gentleman, and when I saw the video I was initially excited, actually. Awesome, someone is actually going to present an opinion on PewDiePie's side while presenting a nuanced analysis of anti-Semitism. Outside of the fact that the video was already basically premised on a claim no one in positions of power was seriously making, I was basically excited to see something different from the other dozen videos I had to watch already. But, I was disappointed. I want to give credit where credit is due, and say that this video does bring up 2 points that I didn't really see in many other places during my research, but it also, unfortunately, fails to address real points being made in the same way that so many other pieces defending Felix do. The video, in large part, attempts to take an angle of an analysis of PewDiePie's actions through the lens of anti-Semitism as is defined in a very specific historical context. However, much of the runtime of the video ultimately comes out to an explanation of anti-Semitism, and much less an application of that analysis onto PewDiePie's work, ultimately coming to the conclusion that, since by its historical contextualizing of Felix himself, he is not an anti-Semite. Which, sure, that's cool. But what does that prove to us? Again, the video takes upon itself the burden to prove something very few people are seriously contesting, and that's a pretty significant theme I see in all of these videos. They're all very acutely concerned with who PewDiePie is, who they think others claim he might be, and who they see him as. They say that he's being called a Nazi, that someone, the media, YouTube, whoever it might be, is trying to take him down. They say he's being purposefully misrepresented. It doesn't matter if any of these things are true, because they all serve the same purpose, to avoid talking about what actually happened and what he has actually done. Everyone chooses to use an indirect frame through which to view these things because if they actually contextualized it correctly, actually thought about the things that occurred independent of any response to them, they would be confronting the fact that these things can't simply be explained away by saying context. Even when the actions themselves are discussed, they're tied to new, made-up claims that just because he did this one thing, he's a Nazi now. Now, it's not a discussion of whether or not the thing that happened was anti-Semitic, it's whether the internet guy is Hitler or not. It's impossible for anyone to truly identify who someone else really is deep down. But that's why his defenders want people to be concerned with who PewDiePie is. When we're not talking about what he's done or who we might extrapolate him to be as a result of it, but rather who he already inherently is, he can be whoever they want him to be. I think it's pretty obvious that I think that what PewDiePie did was anti-Semitic, and that anti-Semitic things are bad. Do I think that what happened was particularly harmful? On its own, maybe not, though I don't think things have to be immediately and directly harmful to be bad. What I was trying to show here was that this conversation was never honest, even from PewDiePie. Many will point to this moment in time and use it as an example of PewDiePie being attacked for no reason, as a sort of justification for everything that happened later. But all I see is Felix and his defenders taking a situation about his actions and turning it into one about his person. Conversations like this, about who people are, about if they could have possibly done such a thing if they weren't this thing, are, in my opinion, much like the other tactics I outlined here, distractions. And as we've seen in this section, that word distractions is the main tenet of the changing of the conversation around PewDiePie. I think that what's most harmful is the way that Felix responded to this criticism about his actions and the rhetoric it created in his fans. The implications that the media was after him, that certain individuals were looking for his downfall, that he was a threat. Even at the time, the beginnings of the expansion of these ideas was becoming evident in the quick involvement of Sargon, Armored Skeptic, and other figures of the right, and their weaving of their problems and grievances into his. From here on out, every future conversation about PewDiePie had been poisoned. Because even though PewDiePie had claimed on several occasions to be apolitical, and even though his defenders would agree, the rhetoric that was begun in the aftermath of January 2017 would be here to stay, and it would only escalate. The second part of our story comes nearly 8 months after the first, in September of 2017, during a live stream on PewDiePie's Twitch channel where he was playing the game PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Felix had engaged in a tense shootout with another player on a bridge, and as a result of that opposing player using tactics he found annoying, PewDiePie hurled an insult at them, an insult which happened to include the racial epithet commonly known as the N-word. He then proceeded to joke about the incident and lament over how he thinks people will overreact to it for nearly 15 minutes. Now, last section we talked a lot about context, and how important it was, at least in that moment, to those defending PewDiePie. And in that bit, it fell on me somewhat to explain that simply invoking context, no matter what the context may be, doesn't mean that anything is permissible. Joe Rogan, if you happen to be watching, that doesn't mean to say that context doesn't matter. In fact, I think context is a very important resource for making judgments. There just aren't contexts that automatically, on their own, decide if a thing was good or bad, so they're only part of how we consider a situation. But here, I don't think it's really necessary that I explain how a white guy using that word in anger in order to demean someone else is basically the worst possible context for it to be used in. Interesting thing though, suddenly context seems to matter a whole lot less, at least if you're asking PewDiePie fans. I think it's pretty clear that they knew the context was bad. In fact, instead of invoking context, the general sentiment was shifted to one of pity, noting how Felix lightly felt after using the word, and excuses, such as suggesting that most people weren't really offended by such a thing. In fact, I would seriously venture that they simply don't care even if the context is bad. And looking at the video after the word was used, it's pretty clear that PewDiePie knows that's the case. Not 15 minutes after it happened, he had these little things to say.
Sometimes I forget that I'm live streaming. But the thing is, I know that no one that's watching this stream gives a shit. Like, you know that.
No one gives a shit.
Nah.
This, to me, pretty clearly shows the attitude of someone who is not only aware of what he has done and is remorseful of it not because he recognizes what is wrong with it, but because of the reaction it will receive from certain groups, but also someone who does not believe what he did was wrong to begin with. PewDiePie saying, "Sometimes I forget I'm live streaming," says clearly to most people, I would guess, that he believes there is a correct context to use that word in that way, one where he won't be scrutinized for it. And while the last controversy was somewhat different in that there was the constant pretense that what occurred in many cases may possibly have been bad, but that the response was an overreaction or targeting, here that pretense barely exists. It's simply a matter of whether what occurred was right or wrong. A little interesting, however, with this situation is that even though PewDiePie seemed to think that only a few of his fans would care, the public consensus was much more split than it was in the case of the previous controversy. While, sure, a lot of creators were pretty solidly behind him, still many, while supporting their decisions in January, took a position of opposition to the incident, though most retained basic support for PewDiePie, and this was pretty significant in light of the fact that in January, only one truly notable figure within PewDiePie's sphere, Jacksepticeye, spoke against him, in what I will add was very mild criticism. Most of the criticism that was made of his use of the word within popular YouTube was very basic, essentially condemning Felix's use of the word, but not connecting it to any larger problem or pattern of behavior. And I want to make clear that I think that these points from notable figures were good and important under the circumstances. But I also think that with this event, it started to become progressively less important what anyone on the outside thought. As I mentioned at the end of the last section, PewDiePie's rhetoric, and by extension the rhetoric of his fans, was shifting. While more popular YouTubers were condemning the incident, and with relatively little pushback, comment sections were filled with people arguing that, in fact, this was all being blown out of proportion, and that people shouldn't be getting so offended over a word, and demonstrating that none of them understood what context was to begin with. Now, I'm hesitant to talk about this, to be perfectly honest, because I don't want to make the claim that commenters are necessarily perfectly representative of the broader PewDiePie fanbase. But I think it demonstrates an important fact, that the broad and unconditional defense of PewDiePie and his fans had begun to divorce itself from popular opinion, at least the popular opinion of the outside. And on those popular YouTubers, who knows, I can't prove that they really thought that PewDiePie should be condemned. Maybe they too were secretly on the side of the fans and that they didn't really care, but thought it was better to come out mildly against it. I'm not in their heads, I literally can't tell you what's going on in there. All I can do is describe what I saw happening, and what I saw was a serious disconnect between the sentiments of those at the top and the reality of opinion for the general active fanbase of PewDiePie. That's why in this section, as well as the next, things are a little harder to frame around these big, popular defenses of PewDiePie in video form. With this controversy, it was no longer easy to navigate PewDiePie's world. Instead of twisting the situation this time, it was in the best interest of those who liked the proliferation of what PewDiePie was doing just to stay silent. And as we discussed earlier, it wasn't the Philip DeFrancos and Boogies of the world who were shifting public opinion in dangerous directions. Sure, they might have been propagating bad takes, but those takes weren't any worse or distributed to any larger an audience than PewDiePie's. It was the right that was pushing those boundaries, and here they were interestingly quite silent. I personally don't think it's an especially fair claim to make here that PewDiePie is, by use of his humor on its own, motivating people towards right-wing beliefs. That's not to say that his humor isn't bad and doesn't normalize pretty abhorrent ideas, or even that it doesn't play a pretty significant role in that, but I think the origin of what many call the quote-unquote PewDie pipeline, that is, the mysterious link between PewDiePie and the far right, is much more dangerous than a lot of people suggest. Most of the most popular videos on the subject kind of rely on this chain of things of exponentially increasing badness, where someone encounters unsavory humor on Felix's channel and through that becomes desensitized to it, to the degree that they find other channels or resources with slightly escalated content, which leads to further escalations, and so on and so forth until they're a full-on Nazi. And I think this is legit, in both the thing that happens and a serious concern. But again, the inherent implication of this line of criticism is that it escalates rhetoric in a way that is removed from PewDiePie, separated from him by a web of minor escalations and actual bad ideas. But what I would argue is that much more insidious is the fact that with PewDiePie, his fans don't have to go anywhere to get this escalation. While in mid-turning to late 2017, this obviously hadn't reached its most extreme point, how Felix was viewed by his fans, or at least how honest they were about those views, was decidedly shifting. In early controversy, the general sentiment was that what happened didn't represent who PewDiePie was, that it was being blown out of proportion, that it was a mistake. But as the mistakes piled up, and the things that happened became harder and harder to defend outright, the easiest point to defend him became simply that it didn't matter. And while PewDiePie, and a lot of his fans I think, would claim that this sense of not caring what PewDiePie did wasn't political or politically motivated, and that their opinions were still motivated by the context of the situations, we've already shown that the context doesn't really matter to his defenders. Their support is unconditional. And when you have pledged your unconditional support to a figure whose actions are inherently deeply political and criticized from an equally political lens, then you have pledged unconditional political alignment. And this plays out exactly how you would think it would. The final major controversy around PewDiePie that we'll be covering today occurred over a year after our last, in December of 2018. In a video which has since been deleted, Felix outlined and promoted several small YouTube channels, which he suggested his followers subscribe to. One of these channels was an individual by the name of ER, an individual whose most popular content was based in media criticism. In fact, PewDiePie recommended them specifically for their review of Netflix's live-action Death Note adaptation. Here's the thing, upon a barely below surface level examination of ER's channel, reveals someone who expresses pretty explicitly extreme right-wing sentiments, both in the form of dog whistles or subtle references and direct presentation. In his apology for the incident, PewDiePie took a somewhat defensive stance, saying,
I mean, again, all I said was, I like this guy's anime review. Anyone with a level-headed brain can tell that I don't know this guy more than this.
But, Pewds, a small correction there. Even that review contained a number of unsavory elements, ranging from simply racist jokes to pretty explicit alt-right dog whistles. This isn't one of those instances where outsiders recognize these things, but the fans of the original deny anything being there. There is no deception on the part of ER's viewers. On a comedy video centered around mocking the concept of privilege, many commentators demonstrate reverence for Hitler and express out there opinions on gender studies. Even more disturbingly, on a video where ER brings significant attention to the fact that Bernie Sanders is Jewish, I'll let you guess why someone might want to note that, certain commenters note being on the channel because of PewDiePie's recommendation. Now, it's largely not for me to determine if Felix would have been able to identify those actual dog whistles, and even if we could say 100% if he could or couldn't, it doesn't really tell us much. Not everyone who can identify such a thing doesn't agree with it, and not everyone who can does. But even ignoring the dog whistles, the jokes remain, and for those, I find there to be much less wiggle room to claim you weren't aware. Either PewDiePie, someone who already said that he wanted to distance himself from that type of humor, saw it, as well as ER's channel, and chose to still include the channel in his list, or watched the video in such an incredibly cursory manner that major themes of humor were lost to him, as well as chose not to look at all into the channel of the video creator, and then still decided it was a good idea to broadcast this individual to his audience of tens of millions of fans. Either PewDiePie really isn't choosing to distance himself from that content, or he is almost criminally negligent. But whichever of the two it may be, and again, because it's a question of who PewDiePie is, not of what he does, they come to the same result. This, to me, is the final major step of the escalation of rhetoric around PewDiePie. With the controversy in early 2017, two sides were created, that of PewDiePie, and by extension his perceived allies, ranging from tame figures such as Philip DeFranco to the fringe of acceptability even on YouTube like Sargon, and that of his enemies, be that the Wall Street Journal, the media more widely, YouTube, Disney, or whatever nebulous entity had been decided upon at any given moment. With the second controversy later that year, support for PewDiePie became truly unconditional, and the general attitude of his defenders went from, well, defensive to a state of apathy. But at the time, that apathy was, I would say, largely influenced by a belief that PewDiePie was essentially apolitical, and that those offended in implicating such things were from the outside, applying those false things onto him. Here, though, we see a new shifting of this apathy, an acknowledgement of PewDiePie's political nature, and a rejection of any meaningful response to that revelation. On a video covering the subject of PewDiePie's recommendation of ER's channel, certain commenters seem almost flippant in their discussion of his content, almost fully acknowledging its abhorrent nature, but entirely dismissive of that fact. And this isn't just a change in his fans. Felix himself has started to lean into an apathy, both towards the presence of political subjects in his content, and the worryingly increasing overlap between his politics and those of the far right. While he had already done these types of things, such as having suggested he wasn't allowed to criticize Lily Singh because he was white in late 2016, only a month before his anti-Semitic slip-up, feeding into right-wing claims of anti-white silencing and oppression, I would argue he had become emboldened, and his content in recent years would seem to support that assertion. In November of 2018, right-wing political commentator Ben Shapiro hosted a short segment at the end of one of PewDiePie's meme review videos, in which he reviewed a number of memes related to himself. To be fair to Felix, Shapiro had, over the past several years, garnered a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a meme, these memes usually being based around two concepts that Shapiro regularly brought up in debate, facts and logic. And so, with this context, I think a lot of people would be really ready to say it wasn't political, or you can't blame any political connotations or implications on PewDiePie. And to that second one, you underestimate me. The fact of the matter here is that not only does it not matter if this was an attempted apolitical video as people claim, but also that it was very explicitly not that. This entire segment of the video is effectively a solid 5 minutes of Ben Shapiro propaganda in a primetime spot on one of the most influential places online. Ben spends a bit of time looking at some memes that are in some way based around him. Interestingly though, the curated list doesn't include arguably the most significant genre of Ben Shapiro meme, ones mocking American conservatism, as Ben makes little quips and all around comes out to look like a pretty cool guy. And at the end, of course, we get to see a nice wide shot of cool guy Ben sitting in front of the logo for the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's very normal and reasonable news site. I don't have to do an in-depth analysis of why this might maybe be more than wholesome meme hour. And this isn't lost on PewDiePie's fans either. Highly popular comments praise Ben Shapiro not just for being a cool guy, but for being a good conservative commentator. They ask for an appearance of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson on the show, someone not memed to anywhere near the same degree or in the same way as Shapiro, their only link being as far-right commentators on perceived social issues. Some even make specifications on the nature of PewDiePie's old enemy, the media, suggesting that actually the media we've been talking about is motivated by a very specific political alignment, the left. That is to say, anyone to the left of John McCain. It's pretty clear by all of this that the viewers of this video weren't kidding themselves about the political nature of it. So why do we keep pretending that PewDiePie is apolitical? When Felix announced in 2019 that he would be making a donation to the Jewish anti-hate group ADL, or Anti-Defamation League, as a sort of reconciliation for past wrongs, a large number of people were very critical of the decision, and critical of the circumstances under which it occurred. And I want to make clear, there are legitimate reasons for not being 100% behind certain groups, the ADL included. But, as you can probably guess, PewDiePie fans weren't critical of this because of minor policy disagreements. They were against it because, in many cases, they opposed the premise of the decision by nature of the fact that conceptually, an anti-hate group of that type was inherently bad. Many even brought up the possibility that the ADL had somehow bullied him into the decision. Ultimately, PewDiePie, without any serious explanation of the reasoning, rescinded his promise of donation. One of the only things he did make specific reference to in this video was that it was weird to be donating to them after they had criticized him, which is a weird take for a donation that, by all appearances, was to apologize to a Jewish anti-hate group for doing something anti-Semitic. All of this comes together to paint a picture of a changing face of PewDiePie's most vocal supporters, and a back-and-forth relationship between him and those supporters in rhetoric. Now, as I touched on earlier, a lot of you are probably already thinking that me looking at a bunch of comments isn't necessarily a great way to analyze the overarching trends of a very broad fanbase. And to be honest, I agree. It's difficult, if not impossible, for me to actually prove in any meaningful way that the actual underlying beliefs of PewDiePie's fans are being changed. But what I can prove by examining these comments is that the sentiments of those who are most vocal and emboldened by him have changed. And with that being the case, I'm not really sure the distinction between whether sentiments themselves have changed, new individuals with those sentiments have joined the fanbase, or individuals already holding those sentiments rose to the front of the fandom really matters that much. Regardless of the specifics of that shift, its cause was very clearly PewDiePie himself, and yet people still claim he's a victim in this whole situation. PewDiePie, the one who followed white supremacists Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux on Twitter. PewDiePie, the one who doesn't believe in cultural appropriation. PewDiePie, the one who even Nazis aren't sure if he's a Nazi or not. I don't care what your specific take on this situation might be. With the information outlined in this episode at your disposal, to claim that PewDiePie is not personally responsible in some way for these changes is to be naive at best and a liar with malicious intent at worst. In April of 2019, following reference to the subscribe to PewDiePie meme by the perpetrator of the tragic Christchurch mosque shooting, Felix officially put out a video putting an end to the meme. And honestly, this is a pretty poetic moment to me. It's one of the final remnants of an era of PewDiePie's content that feels distant even now. He let it go because of the problems it caused, only to enter what is becoming a period of what many would characterize as much more serious problems. And with that, we've made it to the end. And now that we're here, you might be left with several questions that I have yet to really answer in concrete terms. Is PewDiePie a Nazi? I personally don't think so. An anti-Semite? Maybe. A racist? Considering the info I've laid out in this video, I personally think it's probable. But as I said fairly early in this video, I think to focus on any question of who PewDiePie is a mistake. None of us can say who he truly is, deep down. I'm not sure even he could say that. What's far more important to me is what he has done and continues to do. If you're in a bullying relationship where the other individual is constantly telling you that you're their friend while continuing to bully you, it doesn't exactly hold up to say that this person is a friend, they can't be bullying me. At a certain point, it becomes less important what someone says they are and what others say they are, and more important what their actions say they are. With our evidence today being considered, I'll let you make your own judgments personally about the minutiae of that in Felix's case. But in my opinion, the burden of justification falls on those trying to argue that PewDiePie is not what his actions suggest he is. PewDiePie, in the words of those who defend him, is one person. But what he's done, that tells a very different story.